in the scorched valleys between two ancient rivers, where the Tigris carved its relentless path through lands that would witness the birth and death of civilizations, there arose a power so absolute, so merciless in its ambition, that for nearly 3 centuries the known world trembled at the mere whisper of its name. This was Assyria, not merely an empire, but a machine of conquest that would redefine warfare, administration, and the very concept of imperial dominance. Picture, if you will, the year 911 BCE. The Bronze Age has given way to iron, and with it, a new era of bloodshed. In the ruins of what was once the mighty Assyrian heartland, reduced to a collection of city-states barely clinging to relevance after centuries of decline, a king ascends to power who will change everything. His name is Adad-nirari II, and he inherits not an empire but a memory of one, a fading echo of the conquests of Shamshi-Adad and Tiglath-Pileser III, rulers whose glories had long since turned to dust. The world around him is fragmenting. The great powers of the previous age, the Hittites, the Kassites, the Mitanni, have collapsed into oblivion during the catastrophic upheavals of the late Bronze Age collapse. In their absence, smaller kingdoms have emerged. Babylon to the south, now weakened and divided, Aramean tribes flooding into Syria and Mesopotamia like locusts, the kingdoms of Urartu to the north, growing bold in the vacuum of power, and far to the west beyond the great desert, the Phoenician cities thriving on Mediterranean trade, while Egypt, once the supreme power of the ancient Near East, withdraws into its own concerns, its imperial ambitions exhausted. Adad-nirari Seku understands something fundamental that his predecessors had forgotten during the dark centuries of Assyrian weakness. Power abhors a vacuum, and in this fragmented world, there exists an opportunity not merely to survive but to dominate utterly. He begins methodically, not with grandiose campaigns of world conquest, but with the patient work of rebuilding. The Assyrian army is reorganized, transformed from the seasonal levies of farmers into something far more dangerous, a professional standing force capable of campaigning year-round. Iron weapons, still relatively new and precious, are standardized and mass-produced in royal workshops. The chariot corps, that ancient symbol of Near Eastern military might, is expanded and perfected, but most importantly, Adad-nirari introduces systematic training and discipline that will become the hallmark of Assyrian military excellence for generations to come. His campaigns begin modestly, targeting the Aramean tribes that have infiltrated Assyrian territories during the empire's period of weakness. These are not wars of annihilation, not yet, but wars of consolidation and recovery. City by city, valley by valley, Adad-nirari pushes back the tide of foreign settlement, reclaiming lands that his ancestors once ruled. He marches south against Babylon, that ancient rival whose cultural prestige far exceeds its current military power, and forces its king to recognize Assyrian overlordship. The boundary between the two kingdoms is formally established, and more importantly, Assyrian tribute collectors begin appearing in Babylonian territories. When Adad-nirari II dies in 891 BCE, after 2 decades of continuous warfare and reconstruction, he leaves his son, Tukulti-Ninurta II, an empire reborn but still confined largely to its traditional heartland in northern Mesopotamia. The work of expansion will fall to his grandson, and it is here that the true story of Assyrian imperial dominance begins to unfold with terrible inevitability. Ashur-nasirpal II ascends to the throne in 883 BCE, and with his reign, the character of Assyrian imperialism undergoes a fundamental transformation. This king, whose very name means Ashur is guardian of the air, will earn a reputation for brutality that will echo through millennia. His annals, carved in cuneiform script on the walls of his magnificent palace at Kalhu, which the Greeks would later call Nimrud, preserve accounts of military campaigns so graphically violent that they shock readers even today. These are not merely records of victory. They are deliberate instruments of psychological warfare, intended to break the will of potential enemies before a single Assyrian soldier appears on the horizon. Consider one passage from these annals, describing Ashur-nasirpal's treatment of a rebellious city. I built a pillar over against the city gate, and I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and others I bound to stakes round the pillar. I cut the limbs of the officers who had rebelled. Many captives I burned with fire, and many I took as living captives. From some I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. Of many I put out their eyes. I made one pillar of the living and another of heads. This is not the language of a king seeking merely to defeat his enemies. This is the methodology of terror as state policy. But we must resist the temptation to view Ashur-nasirpal simply as a sadistic monster, for that would be to misunderstand the strategic calculation behind these horrors. In the ancient Near East, where communication traveled at the speed of a messenger's feet or a ship's sail, where vast distances separated imperial centers from frontier regions, and where garrison forces were always insufficient to control restive populations through presence alone, terror served a crucial administrative function. Cities that resisted Assyrian conquest faced annihilation and worse. Those that submitted peacefully were often left largely undisturbed, their local rulers retained as vassal kings, their populations unmolested, their economies integrated into the Assyrian system through manageable tribute obligations. The choice was made explicit and stark: submit or suffer unimaginable consequences. Ashur-nasirpal's campaigns carry him far beyond the territories recovered by his grandfather. He marches west into Syria, reaching the Mediterranean Sea and symbolically washing his weapons in its waters, an act laden with ritual significance marking the extent of Assyrian power reaching from the Upper Sea in the east to the Upper Sea in the west, as the inscriptions proclaim. The Phoenician cities, pragmatic merchants to their core, offer tribute without resistance: gold, silver, tin, bronze, ivory, exotic woods, and purple-dyed cloth. The Aramean kingdoms of Syria are crushed one by one, their kings either killed in battle or brought in chains to kneel before the Assyrian throne. To the north, Ashur-nasirpal campaigns against the kingdoms of the Zagros Mountains and the regions that will coalesce into the kingdom of Urartu, that persistent thorn in Assyria's northern flank. These are harsh campaigns through difficult terrain, fighting against mountain peoples who know every pass and ambush point. The Assyrian army adapts, developing specialized mountain warfare techniques and siege equipment capable of reducing fortifications perched on seemingly impregnable heights. But perhaps Ashur-nasirpal's most lasting achievement is not military, but administrative and cultural. He undertakes a massive building program that will establish the physical infrastructure of empire. The old capital at Ashur, that ancient city sacred to the national god, is deemed inadequate for the empire's expanding needs. Ashur-nasirpal instead focuses his attention on Kalhu, transforming what had been a provincial town into a magnificent imperial capital. The palace he constructs there is not merely a royal residence, but a statement of power made manifest in stone and cedar. Its walls are lined with massive stone slabs carved in bas-relief, depicting in meticulous detail the king's military campaigns, his hunting expeditions, his ritual duties, and the supernatural beings that guard his power. These reliefs serve multiple purposes. They are art, certainly, but they are also political propaganda of the highest order, designed to overawe visitors to the court with the king's might and the divine mandate that supports his rule. The palace complex includes administrative buildings, temples, arsenals, and treasuries. It can accommodate thousands of people, and indeed for the palace's inauguration, Ashur-nasirpal claims to have hosted a feast lasting 10 days for 69,574 guests, including 5,000 foreign dignitaries, a number that, even if exaggerated, speaks to the organizational capacity and wealth of the Assyrian state. This is empire not as a collection of conquered territories, but as a functioning administrative system capable of extracting, concentrating, and redistributing resources on an unprecedented scale. When Ashur-nasirpal dies in 859 BCE, after a reign of 24 years, the Assyrian Empire stands transformed. It is no longer merely a Mesopotamian kingdom, but a multi-ethnic, multi-regional imperial system stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean, from the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia to the borders of Babylon. Yet this is only the beginning. The mechanisms of imperial expansion are now in place, tested and proven. The military machine is honed to perfection. The administrative structures for managing conquered territories are established. All that remains is for these tools to be wielded by kings of sufficient ambition and capability, and the ancient Near East will witness the creation of the largest empire the world has yet seen. The throne passes to Ashur-nasir-pal's son, Shalmaneser III, and with him, the Assyrian war machine enters its most expansive phase yet. Where his father had established the foundations of empire, Shalmaneser will attempt to push Assyrian power to its absolute limits, campaigning year after year for more than 3 decades in a relentless pursuit of universal dominion. His reign from 858 to 824 BCE will see the Assyrian army march to every point of the compass, confronting and ultimately grinding down resistance that initially seems formidable but proves unable to withstand the sustained pressure of Assyrian military superiority. Shalmaneser's primary strategic focus lies to the west, in Syria, where a coalition of local kingdoms has formed to resist Assyrian expansion. This is not the disorganized resistance of individual city-states that Ashur-nasir-pal had faced, but a coordinated alliance of considerable power. At its head stands the kingdom of Damascus, the most powerful Aramean state in Syria, ruled by King Hadadezer. Allied with Damascus are the kingdoms of Hamath, the coastal cities of Phoenicia, and crucially, the kingdom of Israel under King Ahab, who despite being a minor player by regional standards, contributes a significant chariot force to the coalition. In 853 BCE, these forces meet the Assyrian army at Karkar on the Orontes River, in what will become one of the most significant battles of the ancient Near East. Shalmaneser's own inscriptions describe the coalition forces in detail, providing a snapshot of the military resources available to the Syrian kingdoms. Damascus contributes 200 chariots, 200 cavalry, and 20,000 infantry. Hamath provides 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, and 10,000 infantry. Ahab of Israel fields 2,000 chariots and 10,000 infantry. The coalition's total strength includes over 3,000 chariots, making this one of the largest concentrations of chariot forces in recorded history. The battle itself rages along the river, and here we encounter one of the persistent challenges in ancient Near Eastern historiography, the problem of unreliable victory claims. Shalmaneser's annals, like those of virtually every ancient monarch, describe a complete and overwhelming victory. He claims to have slaughtered 14,000 enemy soldiers, their bodies so numerous that they choked the Orontes River, forcing the survivors to flee in terror. Yet the strategic situation tells a different story. If Karkar had been the decisive Assyrian victory that Shalmaneser claims, we would expect to see immediate Assyrian expansion into Syria and the submission of the coalition kingdoms. Instead, Shalmaneser is forced to campaign in Syria repeatedly over the next decade, facing renewed coalitions and continued resistance. The truth appears to be that Karkar was at best a Pyrrhic victory for Assyria. The coalition was driven from the field, but it was not destroyed, and the Assyrian army was too exhausted or depleted to immediately capitalize on its tactical success. This pattern will repeat throughout Shalmaneser's reign: military victories that fail to translate into permanent political control, forcing the king to return year after year to reassert Assyrian dominance over the same territories. The Syrian kingdoms prove remarkably resilient, reforming their coalitions, repairing their armies, and continuing to resist even in the face of repeated defeats. Yet Assyrian persistence eventually achieves what single battles cannot. The constant campaigning, the regular devastation of agricultural lands, the steady drain of manpower and resources, these cumulative pressures gradually erode the capacity for resistance. Damascus, the linchpin of Syrian opposition, is repeatedly besieged though never quite captured during Shalmaneser's reign. The kingdom of Israel, exhausted by decades of warfare, descends into political instability. The coalition fragments as individual kingdoms seek separate peace terms with Assyria. While Shalmaneser struggles to subdue Syria completely, he achieves more conclusive successes in other directions. To the south, he maintains pressure on Babylon, not seeking outright conquest but ensuring that Babylon remains too weak and divided to pose a threat to Assyria's southern flank. To the east, he campaigns repeatedly against the kingdoms of the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, pushing Assyrian power deeper into regions that will remain perennial trouble spots for the empire. To the north, he confronts the rising power of Urartu, that confederation of kingdoms centered around Lake Van that is emerging as Assyria's primary rival for control of Anatolia and the northern trade routes. The campaigns against Urartu reveal the limits of Assyrian power even at its height. Urartu occupies defensible mountainous terrain, possesses considerable military capability, and most importantly lies at the periphery of Assyria's logistical reach. Shalmaneser conducts multiple campaigns into Urartian territory, penetrating as far as Lake Van itself, but permanent conquest proves impossible. The Assyrians can raid, they can burn, they can force temporary submission, but they cannot maintain permanent control over these distant highlands. Urartu will remain a persistent enemy and rival throughout the lifetime of the Assyrian Empire, a constant reminder that even the most formidable military machine has geographic and logistical limits. Perhaps the most revealing episode of Shalmaneser's reign comes not from foreign conquest, but from internal crisis. In 827 BCE, after more than 30 years of continuous warfare and approaching the end of his reign, Shalmaneser faces a massive rebellion led by his own son, Ashur-danipal. This civil war, known as the Rebellion of the Turtanu after the title of the Assyrian field marshal who supported the rebel prince, engulfs the empire for 4 years. Major cities, including Nineveh and Ashur itself, join the rebellion against the aging king. The rebellion reveals the strains that constant military expansion has placed on Assyrian society, and also the underlying fragility of a political system that depends so heavily on military success and the personal authority of the king. The fact that such a rebellion could occur and sustain itself for years even while Shalmaneser still lived demonstrates that Assyrian power, impressive as it appeared, rested on foundations that were far from secure. Shalmaneser ultimately prevails, and upon his death in 824 BCE, his chosen successor, Shamshi-Adad-Fid, ascends to the throne, but only after continued fighting to suppress the last remnants of the rebellion. The new king spends the early years of his reign pacifying the empire and restoring the authority that had been compromised during the civil war. The momentum of expansion stalls. Conquered territories in Syria and the West, sensing Assyrian weakness, begin to reassert their independence. Tribute payments lapse. The psychological dominance that Assyrian terror had created begins to fade as subject peoples recognize that the empire is not, after all, invincible. The period following Shamshi-Adad-Fid's death in 811 BCE marks what historians often term the Assyrian recession, not a collapse, but a significant contraction and period of weakness that will last for nearly 8 decades. The throne passes to Adad-nirari III, still a child, and effective power is wielded by his mother, Samuramat, known to Greek tradition as Semiramis, a queen whose historical reality will become so entwined with legend that later Greek historians will credit her with founding Babylon and building its famous walls and hanging gardens. In reality, Samuramat serves as regent for only 5 years. But her prominence as a woman wielding royal authority in the intensely patriarchal Assyrian system is remarkable enough to explain why later tradition seized upon her figure and magnified it into myth. Under Adad-nirari III and his successors, Shalmaneser IV, Ashur-dan III, and Ashur-nirari V, Assyrian power recedes dramatically. The empire retains control of its core territories in northern Mesopotamia, but the extensive conquests of the previous century largely slip away. Syria reasserts independence under the kingdom of Hamath. The Phoenician cities cease sending tribute. Israel and the other Levantine kingdoms reclaim their autonomy. Most significantly, Urartu under King Sarduri II expands dramatically, creating an empire in Anatolia and northern Syria that rivals and even threatens Assyria itself. Multiple factors contribute to this Assyrian decline. Military overextension had drained resources without creating sustainable administrative structures to govern and exploit conquered territories. The civil war under Shalmaneser III had revealed and exacerbated internal political tensions. A series of weak or short-reigning kings failed to provide the strong central authority that the Assyrian system required. Perhaps most critically, environmental factors intervened. Plague epidemics are recorded in the Assyrian chronicles, and there is evidence of harvest failures and famine. An empire that had sustained itself through constant campaigning and the plunder of conquered territories found itself unable to maintain that aggressive posture when internal problems demanded attention and resources. Yet we must be careful not to overstate Assyrian weakness, even during this period. The empire contracts, but it does not collapse. The professional army, though perhaps reduced in size, remains formidable by the standards of the region. The administrative infrastructure continues to function. The ideological commitment to imperial expansion never wavers. It is merely the capacity to act on that ideology that temporarily diminishes. The Assyrian state during this period resembles a predator wounded and temporarily weakened, but not fundamentally changed in its nature, waiting for conditions that will allow it to reassert its dominance. Those conditions arrive with shocking suddenness in 745 BCE, when a usurper seizes the Assyrian throne and takes the throne name Tiglath-Pileser III. This king, whose birth name is unknown, and who may not even have been of royal blood, will in the span of less than 2 decades completely revolutionize the Assyrian imperial system and set in motion the sequence of conquests that will culminate in the creation of the largest empire the ancient world has yet seen. His reign marks the beginning of what historians call the Neo-Assyrian Empire's mature phase, and with him, we witness the transformation of Assyria from a kingdom that conquers into an empire that truly rules. Tiglath-Pileser III inherits an empire in crisis. Internally, powerful provincial governors have amassed virtually independent authority in their regions, creating what amounts to a feudal fragmentation of royal power. Externally, Urartu has expanded into territories that Assyria regards as rightfully its own, building a network of fortresses throughout northern Syria and establishing itself as the dominant power in the region. To the west, the kingdoms of Syria and the Levant have reorganized themselves into new anti-Assyrian coalitions. To the south, Babylon has descended into chaos as Aramean and Chaldean tribes, nomadic peoples who have been infiltrating southern Mesopotamia for centuries, challenge the traditional Babylonian aristocracy for control of the ancient cities. The new king's response is systematic and comprehensive. Rather than immediately launching foreign campaigns, Tiglath-Pileser first turns his attention to restructuring the empire's internal organization. The power of the provincial governors is broken through a combination of political purges, administrative reorganization, and the creation of smaller provinces that reduce the resources and territory under any single governor's control. The army undergoes fundamental reform. Where previous Assyrian armies had combined a core of professional troops with larger numbers of conscripts and levies from subject territories, Tiglath-Pileser creates a much larger standing army of professional soldiers. More radically, he begins systematically recruiting foreigners, particularly cavalry specialists from the mountain regions to the east, creating a multi-ethnic imperial army whose loyalty is to the crown rather than to tribal or regional identities. This is a revolutionary development in ancient Near Eastern warfare, an army that operates as a professional instrument of state power rather than as a seasonal mobilization of the nation in arms. The conquest of territory, which previous Assyrian kings had pursued through a cycle of raid, submission, tribute collection, and renewed raid when submission inevitably lapsed, is replaced with a new model: direct annexation and provincial administration. When Tiglath-Pileser conquers a kingdom, he doesn't merely accept its ruler's submission and impose tribute. Instead, he abolishes the local monarchy, entirely removes the native aristocracy, establishes direct Assyrian administration under a governor appointed by and answerable to the crown, and most dramatically implements a policy that will become the most distinctive and controversial aspect of the Neo-Assyrian system: mass deportation. The policy of mass deportation serves multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. Conquered populations are forcibly relocated from their homelands to distant regions of the empire, breaking their connection to the land and the local power structures that might organize resistance. The deportees are not enslaved. They are resettled as free subjects of the empire, given land to farm, and integrated into the local economies of their new homes. Meanwhile, other populations, often drawn from different recently conquered regions or from the Assyrian heartland, are settled in the deportees' former territories. This policy achieves several objectives. It breaks the capacity for organized rebellion by destroying the social and geographic basis for resistance. It redistributes population from overcrowded or devastated regions to areas where labor is needed. And it creates a mixing of ethnic and linguistic groups that gradually breaks down local identities in favor of a broader imperial identity. The scale of these deportations is staggering. Over the lifetime of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the annals record the deportation of over 4 million people, and this from a region whose total population probably did not exceed 20 million. Entire peoples disappear from history as distinct entities, their languages and cultures dissolved into the multi-ethnic mixture of the empire. It is a form of imperial control that later empires will occasionally emulate, but none will apply on such a vast scale until the 20th century CE provides its own terrible innovations in population transfer. With the internal structure of the empire reformed and the army rebuilt, Tiglath-Pileser turns to external conquest. His campaigns unfold with the methodical efficiency of a chess grandmaster, executing a long-planned strategy. First, he moves north against Urartu, not attempting a direct conquest of that mountainous kingdom, but systematically dismantling its Syrian empire, retaking the fortresses and subject territories that Urartu had built up during Assyria's period of weakness. Kingdom by kingdom, city by city, the Urartian buffer zone is eliminated, and Assyria's northern frontier is secured. Then he pivots west into Syria. The Aramean kingdoms that had reasserted independence are conquered and annexed, their populations deported, their territories organized into Assyrian provinces. The city of Damascus, which had led resistance to Assyrian expansion for over a century, is besieged and captured in 732 BCE. Its last independent king, Rezin, is executed, its leading citizens deported to Media in the distant east, and the ancient city is reduced to the capital of an Assyrian province. The kingdoms of the Levantine coast, Israel, Judah, the Philistine cities, the Phoenician ports, watch these conquests with mounting horror, and one by one, they submit to Assyrian overlordship, sending tribute and hostages to demonstrate their loyalty. But submission no longer guarantees autonomy as it had in the past. Tiglath-Pileser intervenes directly in the internal politics of vassal states, deposing kings who seem unreliable and installing rulers who owe their thrones entirely to Assyrian support. When the northern kingdom of Israel wavers in its loyalty, Tiglath-Pileser invades, strips away more than half its territory, organizes the conquered regions into Assyrian provinces, and leaves only a rump kingdom around the capital of Samaria as a warning to other potential rebels. Most dramatically, Tiglath-Pileser turns south to address the chronic instability in Babylon. The approach he takes here reveals considerable political sophistication and cultural sensitivity. Babylon presents a unique challenge for Assyrian imperialism. Unlike the Aramean kingdoms of Syria or the tribal confederations of the mountains, Babylon possesses a cultural prestige that in many ways exceeds Assyria's own. The Babylonian language and cuneiform script are the lingua franca of international diplomacy throughout the Near East. Babylonian literature, particularly the great mythological texts like the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, are revered throughout Mesopotamia, including in Assyria itself. The city of Babylon and its great temple complex dedicated to Marduk represent, in the cultural imagination of the region, the very center of civilization and cosmic order. To conquer Babylon as one might conquer Damascus or Hamath, to reduce it to a mere province under the rule of an Assyrian governor, would violate something fundamental in the symbolic order of the Mesopotamian world, and risk provoking not only Babylonian resistance but potentially alienating the Assyrian elite itself, many of whom are deeply invested in Babylonian culture. Tiglath-Pileser instead pursues a policy of dual monarchy. He campaigns against the Chaldean tribes that have been destabilizing southern Mesopotamia, defeats them militarily. And then rather than annexing Babylon as Assyrian territory, he has himself crowned as king of Babylon under his birth name, ruling Assyria and Babylon as separate kingdoms united in his person. This precedent will be followed by most of his successors, who will present themselves to their northern subjects as kings of Assyria and to their southern subjects as legitimate kings of Babylon, maintaining the fiction of Babylonian independence even as real power flows from Assyria. When Tiglath-Pileser dies in 727 BCE, after a reign of only 18 years, he leaves an empire transformed. The territorial extent is not dramatically larger than what Ashurnasirpal II or Shalmaneser III had claimed, but the nature of control has changed fundamentally. Where earlier kings had ruled over a core Assyrian territory surrounded by a periphery of tribute-paying vassals whose loyalty was temporary and contingent, Tiglath-Pileser's successors inherit a genuinely integrated empire of provinces under direct administration, bound together by roads, garrisons, and a professional bureaucracy. The empire is still violent, still founded on military conquest and the threat of terror, but it is no longer merely a protection racket operating on a grand scale. It has become a functioning state capable of sustained rule over diverse territories and peoples. The succession passes smoothly to Tiglath-Pileser's son, who takes the throne name Shalmaneser V, but his reign is brief and troubled. Within 2 years, a coup brings to power another usurper who, like Tiglath-Pileser before him, may not have been of royal blood. He takes the throne name Sargon II, deliberately invoking the legendary Sargon of Akkad, who over 2,500 years earlier had created the world's first empire in Mesopotamia. This choice of name reveals much about Assyrian imperial ideology, the constant appeal to an ancient and often mythologized past, the claim to be restoring what had existed before rather than creating something new, the need to ground innovation in tradition. Sargon II's reign from 721 to 705 BCE will see the Assyrian Empire reach its maximum territorial extent and military power, and it will also see the most infamous episode in Assyrian imperial history, the final destruction of the Kingdom of Israel and the deportation of its people, the event that will echo through 3 millennia of religious and cultural memory as the tragedy of the 10 lost tribes. The northern Kingdom of Israel, reduced to a rump state by Tiglath-Pileser's earlier conquests, had continued as an Assyrian vassal through the 720s BCE. But with the death of Tiglath-Pileser and the uncertain succession, Israel's final king, Hoshea, saw an opportunity for independence. He withheld tribute, entered into negotiations with Egypt for military support, and prepared for rebellion. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Sargon's response was methodical and merciless. The Assyrian army besieged Samaria, the Israelite capital, for 3 years. When the city finally fell in 722 BCE, Sargon implemented the full apparatus of the Assyrian provincial system. The Kingdom of Israel was abolished entirely. Its aristocracy, its priestly class, its skilled craftsmen, essentially everyone who might form the basis for organized resistance, were deported. Sargon's annals record the deportation of 27,290 Israelites, relocated to various regions of the empire, primarily to northern Mesopotamia and Media. New populations, drawn from Babylon, Syria, and Arabia, were settled in the former Israelite territories. The cities of Israel were reorganized as Assyrian provinces. The kingdom that had existed for 2 centuries simply ceased to exist as a political or cultural entity. The deportees, scattered across the empire, gradually assimilated into their new environments, their distinct identity dissolving over subsequent generations. The southern kingdom of Judah, watching this disaster unfold from Jerusalem, drew the obvious lesson and remained scrupulously loyal to Assyria. But Sargon's campaigns extend far beyond the elimination of Israel. He confronts the same challenges that have plagued his predecessors, Urartu in the north, Babylon in the south, and increasingly, pressure from new peoples migrating into the Near East from the Eurasian steppes. The Sumerians and Scythians, nomadic horse peoples from beyond the Caucasus, begin raiding into Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, adding a new dimension of instability to Assyria's northern frontier. Sargon campaigns against Urartu repeatedly, finally achieving what his predecessors could not: a decisive defeat of the Urartian army and the sack of several major Urartian cities. The kingdom of Urartu never fully recovers from these defeats, though it continues to exist as a diminished power. To secure his northern conquests, Sargon pushes Assyrian power west into Anatolia, confronting the kingdom of Phrygia and establishing diplomatic relations with distant Greek city-states. In the south, Babylon proves as troublesome under Sargon as it had been under his predecessors. A Chaldean prince named Marduk-apla-iddina II, known to the Bible as Merodach-Baladan, repeatedly seizes the Babylonian throne, forcing Sargon to campaign repeatedly to restore Assyrian control. The back-and-forth struggle for Babylon continues throughout Sargon's reign, a persistent drain on resources and attention. Perhaps Sargon's most lasting achievement is the foundation of a new capital city. Following the precedent set by Ashurnasirpal II, who had moved the capital from Ashur to Kalhu, Sargon constructs an entirely new royal city on a virgin site north of Nineveh. He names it Dur-Sharrukin, Fortress of Sargon, and the archaeological remains, excavated in the 19th century CE, reveal a planned city of breathtaking ambition. The palace complex alone covers nearly 25 acres, its walls decorated with over a mile of sculpted stone reliefs depicting Sargon's military campaigns, hunting expeditions, and ritual functions. The city includes temples, an arsenal, residential quarters for the court and administration, and facilities for manufacturing and trade. It represents urban planning and monumental construction on a scale that rivals anything in the contemporary world. Yet Dur-Sharrukin will be occupied for barely a decade. Sargon dies in 705 BCE, killed in battle during a campaign against Tabal in Anatolia. A shocking fate for an Assyrian king, whose body is not even recovered for proper burial. His son and successor, Sennacherib, interprets his father's death as a divine judgment, abandons the new city, and moves the capital to Nineveh, which will remain the heart of the Assyrian Empire until its final destruction. Sennacherib's reign from 704 to 681 BCE is marked by military campaigns of extraordinary scale and ferocity, but also by a growing sense that the empire, vast as it has become, faces challenges that mere military force cannot fully resolve. The new king inherits all his father's problems and confronts several new ones, most seriously a general rebellion that breaks out across the empire's western territories in the wake of Sargon's unexpected death. Babylon, under the same Marduk-apla-iddina who had plagued Sargon, rebels immediately. Judah, despite its earlier subservience, joins a coalition of Palestinian and Phoenician cities in refusing tribute, apparently encouraged by promises of Egyptian support. In Anatolia, several vassal kingdoms interpret the change in reign as an opportunity to reassert independence. Sennacherib's response to these multiple crises reveals both the strengths and the limitations of Assyrian imperial power at its height. He campaigns methodically, dealing with each rebellion in turn. The Palestinian coalition is crushed, though Egyptian forces attempting to support the rebels are defeated at the Battle of El-Teke. Sennacherib then turns to Judah, whose king, Hezekiah, has fortified Jerusalem and prepared for siege. The Assyrian campaign against Judah in 701 BCE is one of the most thoroughly documented events in ancient Near Eastern history, recorded in Sennacherib's annals, depicted in detailed relief sculptures from his palace in Nineveh, and preserved in multiple accounts in the Hebrew Bible. Sennacherib's army systematically conquers the fortified cities of Judah. The siege and destruction of the fortress city of Lachish is depicted in a famous series of palace reliefs showing every stage of the assault. The siege ramps built against the walls, the battering rams breaking through the fortifications, Assyrian soldiers impaling defenders on stakes, civilians being led away into captivity, and Sennacherib himself seated on his throne receiving the submission of the city's leaders. The reliefs are masterpieces of ancient art and propaganda, showing the Assyrian military machine at its most efficient and terrifying. Jerusalem itself is besieged, but according to both Assyrian and biblical sources, never captured. Sennacherib's annals describe the siege in memorable language. As for Hezekiah the Judahite, I besieged 46 of his fortified cities and countless small towns. I took 150 people, young and old, male and female, together with horses, mules, donkeys, camels, large and small cattle beyond counting, and considered them spoil. Hezekiah himself I locked up like a caged bird in Jerusalem, his royal city. Yet the siege ends not with the city's capture, but with Hezekiah's submission and payment of massive tribute. The biblical account attributes the Assyrian withdrawal to divine intervention, an angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. Modern historians have speculated about plague, logistical difficulties, or news of trouble elsewhere in the empire, forcing Sennacherib to accept a negotiated settlement rather than prosecuting the siege to its conclusion. Whatever the reason, Jerusalem survives, and the kingdom of Judah, though devastated and reduced to vassal status, continues to exist. A rare instance of a state that rebelled against Assyria, surviving the experience relatively intact. But it is in Babylon that Sennacherib faces his greatest challenge and commits his most controversial act. Marduk-apla-iddina proves as resilient as ever, repeatedly reclaiming the Babylonian throne despite Assyrian military interventions. Sennacherib campaigns in southern Mesopotamia year after year, pursuing Chaldean forces through the marshes of the Persian Gulf, even constructing a fleet to conduct amphibious operations against rebel strongholds. The war drags on, draining resources and attention. Finally, in 689 BCE, after yet another Babylonian rebellion supported by the neighboring kingdom of Elam, Sennacherib's patience expires utterly. He marches on Babylon itself, not to reclaim it as his predecessors had done, not to install another loyal ruler or to crown himself king of Babylon as Tiglath-Pileser had, but to destroy it completely. The annals record the event in stark terms. The walls of Babylon are demolished, its great buildings torn down, its temples including the sacred Esagila temple of Marduk are plundered and burned, its population is massacred or deported, and most symbolically devastating, Sennacherib orders the Euphrates River diverted to flood the ruins, literally attempting to erase the city from existence. The destruction of Babylon sends shockwaves throughout the ancient Near East. This is not merely the conquest of another city. This is an assault on the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization, a sacrilege against the ancient gods themselves. The cultural and religious ramifications are profound. Babylon is not just a political center, but a sacred space, the dwelling place of Marduk, chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, the site of the Esagila temple where, according to myth, the destinies of the world are determined each new year. By destroying Babylon, Sennacherib violates the fundamental religious sensibilities of Mesopotamian civilization, including those of many Assyrians who venerate Babylonian culture and theology. The act proves politically disastrous. While it temporarily eliminates Babylonian resistance, it creates a moral crisis within Assyria itself. Elements of the Assyrian aristocracy, particularly those with cultural and economic ties to Babylon, are horrified. The theological implications are troubling. Has the king, by destroying the sacred city, brought divine disfavor upon Assyria? The questions multiply and fester, creating an atmosphere of unease despite the empire's apparent military invincibility. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib is assassinated, murdered by his own sons in an act of parricide that later sources will interpret as divine judgment for his destruction of Babylon. The succession crisis that follows is brief but violent. Sennacherib's designated heir, Esarhaddon, is not the eldest son, and his brothers refuse to accept his accession. Civil war looms, but Esarhaddon, demonstrating both military skill and political acumen, defeats his brother's forces and secures the throne. His reign, from 680 to 1669 BCE, will be dominated by two major policy objectives: the reconstruction of Babylon and the conquest of Egypt. The decision to rebuild Babylon represents a complete reversal of his father's policy and is undertaken with explicit religious justification. Esarhaddon presents the reconstruction as an act of piety, a restoration of divine order, an expiation of his father's sin against the gods. The project is massive, involving not just the rebuilding of physical structures but the repatriation of deported populations, the restoration of temple properties and revenues, and the reinstatement of traditional Babylonian festivals and rituals. The rebuilt Babylon, while firmly under Assyrian control, is presented as a restoration of ancient glory rather than a conquered province. This policy proves successful in reconciling Babylonian sentiment and provides stability in southern Mesopotamia for the remainder of Esarhaddon's reign. But it is Egypt that dominates Esarhaddon's strategic vision. Since the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III, Egypt has been a persistent source of interference in Assyrian affairs, encouraging rebellion among the Levantine states, offering support that materializes just enough to prolong resistance without ever committing sufficient force to actually threaten Assyrian dominance. Esarhaddon determines to eliminate this problem at its source by conquering Egypt itself. The logistical challenges are immense. Egypt lies at the far western edge of the Assyrian world, requiring the army to march through hundreds of miles of Palestinian and Sinai territory. The desert crossing is particularly difficult, requiring extensive advance preparation to establish water supplies and supply depots. Egypt itself, while no longer the superpower it had been during the New Kingdom centuries earlier, remains formidable. It is protected by natural barriers, deserts to the east and west, cataracts to the south, the Mediterranean to the north. Its population is large and culturally unified. Most critically, Egypt has not been successfully invaded by an Asiatic power in nearly 2 millennia. The psychological barrier is as significant as the geographical ones. Esarhaddon's first invasion attempt in 674 BCE ends in failure, a rare Assyrian military defeat that demonstrates the limits of even the most sophisticated ancient army when operating at extreme logistical range. But Esarhaddon persists. In 671 BCE, a reorganized and reinforced Assyrian army invades Egypt again. This time, the campaign is meticulously planned. The logistics are carefully managed. The army marches from Assyria in stages, pausing to consolidate supply lines and await reinforcements. The crossing of the Sinai is accomplished without the disasters that had plagued earlier attempts. The Assyrian army confronts the Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Taharka of the 25th dynasty, a Kushite dynasty ruling Egypt from Nubia. The battles are fierce. This is not conquest of minor kingdoms but the clash of empires. Egyptian soldiers, fighting for their homeland, prove formidable opponents. But Assyrian military superiority, particularly in siege warfare and combined arms tactics, gradually prevails. The Delta fortresses fall one by one. The Assyrian army advances up the Nile, capturing Memphis, the ancient capital. Taharka retreats south to Thebes and eventually to Nubia, leaving Lower Egypt in Assyrian hands. Esarhaddon does not attempt to establish direct Assyrian administration over all of Egypt. The distance is too great, the cultural differences too profound. Instead, he establishes a system of indirect rule, confirming local Egyptian nobles and princes as vassal rulers under overall Assyrian overlordship. 20 petty kings rule in Egypt, all nominally subject to Assyrian authority, required to pay tribute and provide military support when requested. It is a remarkable achievement. The Assyrian Empire now stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Upper Egypt. No ancient Near Eastern empire has ever controlled such vast territories. Assyria has achieved the dream of universal empire that its kings have proclaimed for centuries. Dominion from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, from sunrise to sunset, the 4 quarters of the world under a single ruler. Yet this achievement proves impossible to maintain. Even as Esarhaddon celebrates his Egyptian conquest, instability emerges. In 669 BCE, while preparing another campaign to Egypt to suppress a rebellion by Taharka, Esarhaddon dies, possibly from illness. The succession passes to his son Ashurbanipal, and the new king inherits an empire at its maximum extent, but also facing challenges that will ultimately prove insurmountable. Ashurbanipal's reign, from 668 to approximately 631 BCE, represents simultaneously the cultural apex of Assyrian civilization and the beginning of its terminal decline. This king, whose name means Ashur is creator of an heir, is perhaps the most complex figure in Assyrian history. A warrior who campaigns as tirelessly as his predecessors, but also a scholar and patron of learning who assembles the greatest library the ancient world has yet seen. His campaigns are necessary and relentless. Egypt immediately rebels upon Esarhaddon's death, with Taharqa reclaiming Lower Egypt and expelling the Assyrian garrisons. Ashurbanipal responds with overwhelming force, invading Egypt in 667 BCE, and not only retaking the delta but pursuing Taharqa far up the Nile, capturing and sacking Thebes itself in 663 BCE, an event so traumatic that it is referenced in biblical prophecy as an example of the fate awaiting cities that oppose the divine will. The sack of Thebes, with its ancient temples and accumulated treasures of millennia, sends shockwaves through the Mediterranean world. The wealth plundered from Thebes' temples flows back to Assyria, enriching the imperial center, but also marking the absolute limit of Assyrian expansion. Egypt, devastated by repeated invasions, is placed under the rule of Samtik-Ippur, an Egyptian noble who initially serves as an Assyrian vassal, but who will, over the following decades, gradually reassert Egyptian independence as Assyrian power wanes. But the most dramatic and revealing conflict of Ashurbanipal's reign occurs not at the empire's distant frontiers but within the royal family itself. In keeping with Esarhaddon's succession arrangements, Ashurbanipal's brother Shamash-Shuma-Ukin had been installed as king of Babylon, creating again the dual monarchy system that Tiglath-Pileser III had pioneered. But the arrangement proves unstable. Shamash-Shuma-Ukin, reigning in Babylon and immersed in Babylonian culture, comes to resent his subordination to his brother in Nineveh. Tensions escalate over 16 years until, in 652 BCE, Shamash-Shuma-Ukin openly rebels, assembling a coalition that includes not just Babylon, but also the Chaldean tribes of southern Mesopotamia, Elam to the east, and various other peoples chafing under Assyrian rule. The civil war that follows is devastating, lasting 4 years and consuming resources that the empire can ill afford to expend. Ashurbanipal prosecutes the war with characteristic Assyrian thoroughness, systematically defeating coalition forces, besieging rebel cities, and ultimately reducing Babylon itself through a prolonged siege that results in mass starvation and plague within the city. When Babylon finally falls in 648 BCE, Shamash-Shuma-Ukin is dead. Whether killed in battle, executed, or having committed suicide remains unclear. The suppression of the rebellion is followed by systematic retaliation. Ashurbanipal turns on Elam, which had supported his brother's rebellion, with particular fury. Multiple campaigns devastate Elam so completely that it effectively ceases to exist as an independent kingdom. The Assyrian annals describe the conquest with grim satisfaction. The capital Susa is sacked, its temples desecrated, its population massacred or deported. Even the tombs of ancient Elamite kings are violated, and their remains scattered. It is vengeance pursued with an almost pathological intensity, and while it eliminates a traditional enemy, it also exhausts Assyrian military resources and creates power vacuums on the eastern frontier that will soon be filled by new and more dangerous peoples. Despite, or perhaps because of, these constant military campaigns, Ashurbanipal finds time to pursue cultural and intellectual projects on an unprecedented scale. At Nineveh, he assembles a library that represents the culmination of Mesopotamian learning. Scribes are sent throughout the empire to copy literary, religious, scientific, and historical texts from temple and palace archives. The library eventually contains over 30,000 clay tablets covering virtually every area of Mesopotamian knowledge. Myths and epics, including the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that we know today, rituals and prayers, omen texts and divination manuals, medical texts, mathematical and astronomical works, historical chronicles, and administrative documents. This library is more than a mere collection. It represents a conscious attempt to gather and preserve the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization. That Ashurbanipal undertakes this project even while campaigning continuously suggests a king aware, perhaps, that he presides over a civilization at its peak, but also potentially facing an uncertain future. The library will remain buried in the ruins of Nineveh after the city's destruction, its tablets preserved by the very fire that consumed the palace, until its excavation in the 19th century CE will provide modern scholars with an unparalleled window into ancient Mesopotamian culture. Yet even as Ashurbanipal assembles his library, and celebrates his military victories, the foundations of Assyrian power are eroding. The constant warfare has bled the empire of manpower and resources. The deportation policies that had once broken resistance now create restive mixed populations with no particular loyalty to Assyria. The professional army, while still formidable, is increasingly composed of foreign recruits whose commitment is mercenary rather than ideological. The provinces, administered by governors who must maintain order and collect tribute while the military is constantly deployed elsewhere, face increasing difficulty. Most ominously, new powers are emerging on the empire's periphery. In Anatolia, the kingdom of Lydia is consolidating under King Gyges, creating a new power center that will eventually dominate western Anatolia. In the Iranian plateau, the Medes are coalescing from tribal confederations into an organized kingdom. To the south, in the deserts of Arabia, Arab tribes are becoming more organized and aggressive. And in Babylon, despite the suppression of Shamash Shuma-Ukin's rebellion, Chaldean identity and resistance to Assyrian rule continue to smolder, needing only opportunity to reignite. The precise chronology of Ashurbanipal's final years is obscure. The annals cease recording events after about 636 BCE, and the date of his death is uncertain, somewhere between 631 and 627 BCE. A succession crisis follows, with multiple claimants fighting for the throne. The sources are fragmentary and contradictory, but they reveal an empire descending into civil war. Ashurbanipal's son, Sin-shara-ishkun, eventually emerges as king in Nineveh, but his brother Ashur-etil-ilani may have ruled simultaneously in Babylon or as a rival claimant. The details are murky, but the pattern is clear. The strong centralized authority that had been the key to Assyrian power is fragmenting. Into this chaos steps a figure who will prove to be Assyria's nemesis. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who seizes control of Babylon in 626 BCE and successfully declares independence from Assyrian rule. Unlike previous Babylonian rebels, Nabopolassar manages to consolidate his position and establish a new dynasty. Sin-shara-ishkun's attempts to recapture Babylon fail. The Assyrian army, for decades seemingly invincible, suffers defeat after defeat. The psychological impact is profound. Subject peoples throughout the empire begin to recognize that Assyria is not, after all, invincible, that the empire that had dominated the Near East for over a century is showing fatal weaknesses. In 615 BCE, the situation deteriorates catastrophically. Cyaxares, king of the Medes, invades Assyrian territory from the east, capturing several cities including the ancient religious capital of Ashur. Nabopolassar's Babylonian forces coordinate with the Medes, and for the first time in Assyrian history, the empire faces a coordinated two-front assault by major powers. The Assyrian army, stretched thin and demoralized by repeated defeats, begins to disintegrate. Provinces rebel or simply cease acknowledging Assyrian authority. The tribute network that had sustained the empire collapses. In 612 BCE, the end comes with shocking rapidity. A combined Median and Babylonian army, possibly reinforced by Scythian allies, besieges Nineveh itself. The great capital, with its massive walls that had seemed impregnable, falls after a siege of only 3 months. The city is sacked and burned with a thoroughness that recalls Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon a century earlier. The destruction is so complete that the site will remain buried and lost for over 2 millennia. Sin-shara-ishkun dies in the flames of his palace, and with him, the Neo-Assyrian Empire effectively ends. Yet even now, Assyrian resistance continues. An Assyrian general or prince named Ashur-uballit II escapes the destruction of Nineveh and establishes a remnant kingdom at Haran in northwestern Mesopotamia. For 4 more years, this last fragment of Assyria persists, receiving support from Egypt, a remarkable reversal as Egypt now seeks to preserve what remains of Assyria as a buffer against the rising power of Babylon and Media. But the effort is futile. In 609 BCE, Haran falls to the Babylonians. Ashur-uballit II disappears from history, and with him, The Assyrian state ceases to exist after nearly 2,000 years of continuous existence dating back to the early 2nd millennium BCE. The fall of Assyria is total and irreversible. Unlike earlier empires, the Akkadians, the Ur-3 dynasty, the Old Babylonians, which collapsed, but left successor states and cultural continuity, Assyria simply vanishes as a political entity. The great cities, Ashur, Kalhu, Nineveh, Dur-Sharrukin, are abandoned, their populations dispersed, their buildings reduced to rubble. The Assyrian language, already increasingly giving way to Aramaic, ceases to be written and eventually disappears entirely as a living tongue. The Assyrian people, insofar as they maintained a distinct ethnic identity, are absorbed into the multi-ethnic mixture of Mesopotamian populations. Within a generation, Assyria exists only as a geographic expression, a former empire whose very name will become, in Jewish, Greek, and later Christian tradition, a byword for tyranny and oppression. Why did Assyria fall so completely and so rapidly? The question has occupied historians for over a century, and the answers are multiple and interconnected. Military overextension is certainly part of the explanation. The empire at its height was simply too large to be effectively controlled with ancient logistics and communications technology. Maintaining garrisons throughout territories stretching from Egypt to Iran, suppressing rebellions, defending multiple frontiers simultaneously, these tasks eventually exceeded even Assyria's sophisticated military capabilities. The constant warfare necessary to maintain the empire depleted manpower and resources faster than they could be replenished. The deportation policies that had been intended to prevent rebellion by mixing populations and breaking local identities had the unintended consequence of creating an empire of the resentful, populations with no organic loyalty to Assyrian rule. When Assyrian military power wavered, there was no reservoir of support to draw upon, no ideology that transcended ethnic and regional identities and bound subjects to the empire through anything other than fear. The Assyrian system had created administrative efficiency and military dominance, but not political legitimacy beyond the Assyrian heartland. Economic factors contributed as well. The empire's economy was heavily dependent on plunder and tribute from conquered territories. When expansion ceased and subject territories began successfully rebelling, the flow of wealth to the imperial center declined dramatically. The costs of maintaining the military and administrative apparatus remained constant while revenues declined, creating a fiscal crisis that further weakened the state's capacity to respond to challenges. Environmental and demographic factors may have played a role as well, though the evidence is less clear. There are suggestions of climate deterioration, of droughts affecting agricultural productivity in northern Mesopotamia. Plague epidemics are mentioned in later sources. Population decline in the Assyrian heartland, whether from disease, warfare, or emigration, would have reduced the manpower base upon which military recruitment depended. Perhaps most fundamentally, Assyria fell because it faced simultaneously multiple powerful enemies who recognized that coordination was the key to victory. The alliance between Media and Babylon was unprecedented in its effectiveness. Previous Assyrian enemies had typically been defeated in detail, one at a time, before they could organize effective coalitions. But by the 610s BCE, with the empire visibly weakening and the memory of Assyrian invincibility fading, Cyaxares and Nabopolassar were able to maintain their alliance long enough to accomplish what no individual kingdom could have achieved. The fall of Assyria had immediate and profound consequences for the ancient Near East. The power vacuum created by Assyria's destruction was filled by four major successor states: the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar and his more famous son, Nebuchadnezzar II, which dominated Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant; the Median Kingdom, which controlled Iran and eastern Anatolia, Lydia and western Anatolia, and a briefly resurgent Egypt under the 26th dynasty, which reclaimed some independence before eventually falling to Persia. But the most significant long-term consequence was the creation of conditions that would, within a few generations, lead to the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Persians, initially vassals of the Medes, would overthrow their overlords, conquer Babylon, Lydia, and eventually Egypt, creating an empire even larger than Assyria at its height. The Persians, however, learned from Assyria's failures, developing a more sophisticated system of provincial administration, showing greater religious tolerance, and creating an imperial ideology that emphasized the mutual benefits of empire rather than relying solely on terror. Yet, the legacy of Assyria extends far beyond its immediate successors. In military affairs, Assyrian innovations, the professional standing army combined arms tactics, sophisticated siege warfare, military engineering, the use of cavalry, rapid strategic mobility, and centralized logistics, became standard features of ancient Near Eastern warfare and were adopted by every subsequent empire in the region. The Persians, Macedonians under Alexander, and eventually the Romans all drew upon and adapted Assyrian military practices. In administration, Assyria developed the template for imperial governance that would be refined by subsequent empires. The division of territories into provinces under appointed governors, the development of a professional bureaucracy, the use of standardized communications and reporting systems, the construction of imperial road networks, and the practice of resettling populations as a tool of state policy. The Assyrian system of intelligence gathering and diplomatic communications using relay stations and courier systems to rapidly transmit information across vast distances was adopted and expanded by the Persians in their famous royal road system and eventually influenced Roman practices. In cultural terms, Assyria's legacy is more complex and contested. The Assyrians were both destroyers and preservers of culture. They destroyed countless cities, including Babylon and Thebes, centers of ancient civilization. They deported millions of people, breaking cultural continuities and extinguishing languages and traditions. Yet they also preserved Mesopotamian culture through projects like Ashurbanipal's library, which collected and systematized the literary heritage of the ancient Near East. Assyrian art, particularly the magnificent relief sculptures that decorated their palaces, influenced artistic traditions throughout the region. The palace reliefs depicting royal hunts, military campaigns, and ritual scenes set standards for the representation of power and divine kingship that would echo through Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman imperial art. In the realm of religion and ideology, Assyria's impact was profound, though often negative. The experience of Assyrian conquest and deportation shaped the historical consciousness of numerous peoples, most influentially the Jews. The destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and the deportation of its people is preserved in biblical memory as a national catastrophe and divine judgment. Later Jewish prophets, writing during and after the Babylonian exile, repeatedly invoke Assyria as the archetypal oppressor. The rod of God's anger used to punish Israel and Judah for their sins, but itself destined for destruction as judgment for its excessive cruelty. The Book of Nahum is an entire prophetic work devoted to celebrating the destruction of Nineveh, calling it the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. This biblical perspective on Assyria as uniquely evil would be transmitted through Christianity and Islam to subsequent civilizations, ensuring that Assyria would remain, for millennia, a symbol of imperial tyranny and blasphemous pride. When 19th century CE archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities, they approached these sites with expectations shaped by biblical descriptions and initially interpreted the discoveries, particularly the reliefs depicting military violence, through this lens of Assyria as an empire of unparalleled cruelty. Modern scholarship has attempted to provide more nuanced assessments. While there is no denying the violent character of Assyrian imperialism, the annals and relief sculptures provide overwhelming primary source evidence. Historians now recognize that Assyrian violence was not unique in its ancient context, but rather extreme in its scale and its systematic documentation. Other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms practiced similar violence when they had the power to do so. The Assyrians were simply more successful and more thorough in recording their actions. The terror tactics that seem so horrifying to modern sensibilities served rational strategic purposes in an ancient world where communication and control over distant territories were difficult, where garrison forces were always insufficient, and where rebellion was a constant threat. Moreover, the Assyrian Empire was not solely or even primarily characterized by violence. Most of the empire's subjects most of the time lived under reasonably stable conditions, engaged in agriculture, craft production, and trade, paid their taxes, and rarely encountered Assyrian soldiers. The roads were kept safe, trade flourished, agricultural techniques improved, and in many regions, standards of living likely increased under Assyrian rule compared to the conditions of political fragmentation and continuous small-scale warfare that had preceded it. The archaeological record from Assyrian provincial sites shows prosperous towns, sophisticated urban planning, and cultural mixing that, while certainly imposed from above through deportation policies, also created cosmopolitan environments where different peoples and traditions interacted and influenced each other. The Assyrian legacy includes not just violence, but also the first successful attempt to create a multi-ethnic, multi-regional empire governed through sophisticated administrative systems rather than mere military occupation. This achievement, imperfect and ultimately unsustainable as it proved, established precedents and demonstrated possibilities that would influence all subsequent attempts at universal empire in the ancient world. In the memory of the peoples who experienced it, Assyria remained the standard against which later empires were measured. When the Persian Empire arose, it presented itself explicitly as different from Assyria, more tolerant, more culturally sophisticated, more concerned with justice than mere power. Whether or not Persian propaganda accurately represented Persian practice is debatable, but the fact that the Persians felt compelled to differentiate themselves from Assyria reveals how powerfully the Assyrian example dominated ancient Near Eastern political consciousness. Similarly, when Greek historians wrote about Eastern empires, Assyria served as the archetypal Oriental despotism, a negative exemplar against which Greek freedom and political culture could be contrasted. The legends of Semiramis and Sardanapalus, Hellenistic elaborations on Assyrian historical figures that bear little resemblance to historical reality, become standard elements in Greek and Roman historical and literary traditions, keeping the memory of Assyria alive, even as accurate knowledge of Assyrian history fades. For nearly 2 millennia after its fall, Assyria existed primarily as literary and biblical memory, its physical remains buried under tells and hillsides throughout northern Iraq. The 19th century CE brought a remarkable resurrection through archaeology. British, French, and eventually American archaeologists excavated the major Assyrian sites, Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, Ashur, recovering massive stone sculptures, miles of relief panels, and most importantly, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, including the libraries of Ashurbanipal. These discoveries revolutionized understanding of the ancient Near East and provided primary sources for reconstructing Assyrian history from Assyrian perspectives rather than relying solely on biblical and classical sources that were often hostile and inaccurate. The decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century CE allowed scholars to read the annals of Assyrian kings, their administrative documents, their literary works, their religious texts. A civilization that had been known primarily through its enemies' denunciations could now speak for itself. The result was a more complex picture. Assyria emerged not just as a military machine, but as a sophisticated civilization with achievements in art, literature, technology, and administration. Yet the process of recovering Assyria's history has been complicated by both ancient and modern politics. The archaeological remains became entangled in the cultural politics of the modern Middle East. The Assyrian people, Christian communities in northern Iraq and surrounding regions who claim descent from ancient Assyrians and maintain distinctive linguistic and cultural traditions, have sought to claim this heritage, seeing in the rediscovery of Assyrian civilization validation of their identity and historical continuity. Whether modern Assyrians are genuinely descended from ancient Assyrians is a question that combines genetics, linguistics, and politics in ways that defy simple answers, but the emotional and political resonance of the connection is undeniable. The physical remains of Assyrian civilization have suffered repeated damage in modern conflicts. The Iraq War and its aftermath brought looting of archaeological sites and museums. The rise of ISIS in 2014 CE resulted in deliberate destruction of Assyrian remains, including the dynamiting of parts of Nineveh and Nimrud, as part of ISIS's campaign against what they termed idolatry. These destructions, broadcast in propaganda videos, ironically echoed ancient Assyrian practices of destroying the symbols of conquered peoples, completing a cycle of violence across millennia. Yet despite all destructions, ancient and modern, enough survives to allow us to reconstruct in considerable detail the rise, expansion, and fall of the Assyrian Empire. We can trace its development from a city-state on the Tigris to the dominant power of the ancient Near East. We can analyze the military, administrative, and economic mechanisms that enabled its expansion. We can examine the art and architecture that expressed its ideology of power. We can read the words of its kings boasting of their conquests, and of its scribes recording the mundane details of imperial administration. We can even, through careful analysis of skeletal remains and settlement patterns, begin to understand the demographic and environmental factors that influenced its trajectory. What emerges from this evidence is a portrait of empire in its ancient Near Eastern form. A system of power based on military superiority, administrative sophistication, and ideological claims to universal dominion, but also inherently unstable, requiring constant expansion to sustain itself, generating resistance through its very methods of control, and vulnerable to the combination of internal weakness and external pressure. Assyria was not unique in these characteristics. Every ancient empire faced similar dynamics, but it represents these features in particularly clear and extreme form, making it a crucial case study for understanding the mechanisms and limitations of pre-modern imperial systems. The story of Assyria is ultimately a story about the possibilities and limits of power. For nearly 3 centuries, from the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III in 745 BCE to the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, and for an additional 2 centuries before that during the earlier phases of expansion, Assyria demonstrated that a well-organized state with superior military technology and tactics, sophisticated administrative systems, and ruthless determination could dominate vast territories and diverse peoples. It proved that terror could be an effective instrument of policy, that mass deportations could break resistance, that professional armies could conquer and hold territories far from the imperial center. But Assyria also demonstrated the limits of these methods. Terror generates hatred that, given opportunity, explodes into rebellion. Deportations create resentful populations with no loyalty to the state. Professional armies are expensive to maintain and can be defeated. Administrative systems can become corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scale of the territories they must govern. Ideologies of universal empire can blind rulers to practical limitations, and ultimately, no empire, no matter how powerful, can sustain itself indefinitely through military force alone, without developing sources of legitimacy and loyalty that transcend fear. The Assyrian Empire fell, but the dream of empire that it embodied, the vision of a single power imposing order on a diverse and fractious world, did not die with it. That dream would be taken up by the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, and in different forms by every subsequent civilization that achieved sufficient power to attempt its realization. Each would face variations of the challenges that Assyria confronted: how to control vast territories, how to integrate diverse peoples, how to sustain loyalty, or at least obedience, how to balance the costs of empire against its benefits, how to avoid overextension, how to manage succession and internal stability while maintaining external dominance. Some would succeed for longer than Assyria, developing more sophisticated solutions to these perennial problems of empire. None would find permanent solutions because the fundamental tensions inherent in imperial systems, between center and periphery, between the powerful and the subjected, between the ideological claims of universal order and the practical realities of limited resources and human resistance to domination, are not ultimately resolvable through any set of administrative techniques or military strategies. In this sense, Assyria's legacy is not just the specific institutions and practices it pioneered, but the broader example it provides of both the possibilities and the inevitable limitations of imperial power. The ruins of Nineveh, whether standing as tourist attractions or reduced to rubble by modern conflicts, remain monuments to a civilization that achieved extraordinary power, made lasting contributions to human political and cultural development, committed atrocities on a scale that shocked even its contemporary world, and ultimately discovered that even the mightiest empire cannot escape the consequences of its own actions or the inexorable processes of historical change. The story of Assyria, from the first tentative expansions under Adad-nirari II to the final desperate defense at Haran, is a human story of ambition and achievement, of cruelty and creativity, of the drive for dominance and the resistance it inevitably provokes. It is a story that ended over 2,600 years ago with the fall of the last Assyrian stronghold, yet it continues to resonate because the fundamental dynamics it illustrates, the rise and fall of great powers, the exercise and limits of military might, the costs of empire both to conquerors and conquered, remain relevant to every age, including our own.